So for those of you I don't know, my name is Nick Miller. I'm the Executive Director at the Venture College at Boise State University, which is a program in the College of Innovation and Design. In the middle or late end of last week, sat down with TM Rostegar and Jim Matheson and started talking about ways that our community can help support startups in Boise and really throughout Idaho. And this is what we came up with. And we're going to be doing several of these. I think first I'd like to thank Jim, Melanie, and Mark for making time to put this together and to share their knowledge and expertise. They're all in demand on a local, regional, and national level. So the time that we carved out here, we're extremely grateful for. And we hope that all of you will stick around for the call, ask plenty of questions, and we hope that the engagement goes beyond here. Both Trailhead and the Venture College are available for offline conversations to help you out, and we want to be a resource to our startup community. One thing, just another note on the chat, if you wouldn't mind just going in and messaging everyone, just introducing yourself, maybe where you're at or where you're calling in from, and your company or the organization that you're with, just so we can get an idea of everyone who's here. And with that, I will hand it off to TM.
Thank you, Nick. And for those who don't know me, TM Rostegar here, Executive Director with Trailhead. And I'm just going to briefly set the table and get out of the way so we can get our fantastic panelists here engaged with our audience. So the backstory to Survive to Thrive is that in late January, Trailhead, the Venture College, and Jim Matheson conceived a new program, and it was called the 10X Weekend. The premise was that we would get together with startup founders and have a weekend where we would help them 10X their revenue. And so that was in January. Obviously, some things happened since January, and we had to scrap and pivot our plans. And that is how we arrived at Survive to Thrive. We quickly pivoted away from a 10X weekend because the feasibility of getting 10 plus people together offsite during a weekend is just not feasible these days. And so here we are, Survive to Thrive, our version of a pivoted program that was called the 10X Weekend. And the interesting part is, I get to listen to a lot of pitches from startup founders and small to medium-sized businesses. And in none of the pitches that I've heard so far have I seen a slide that says, and here's how our startup will respond to a global pandemic. And so that said, it's not something that most of us think about, us being startup founders and small to medium business-sized owners. And so, however, while we don't think about it and we don't put this in our slide decks, while COVID-19 is unique and presents a unique challenge, macroeconomic shocks aren't unique. In other words, we go through other downturns, and there have been some in recent history. And from those downturns, we have lessons learned and best practices, and that is the intent for today. We're pooling lessons learned and knowledge and best practices from experts who have weathered these downturns before and are stepping up today and are willing to share that with our community here in Boise and beyond. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Matheson, and we can get started on the program.
Great, thanks TM and Nick. Appreciate your leadership on this, and especially the community support from Trailhead and Boise State. I mean, the old adage is that it takes a village to do anything meaningful, and I think in these times that is effectively the case. So for everyone that's joining, we have a really cross-sectional group. This program was originally conceived to focus on the kind of startup and smaller company leaders, and we have a number of those that are present, but we also have a great set of other community leaders, lenders, vendors, service providers, and I think to the point of it taking a village, it really also impacts the village when the small companies or the service providers' businesses are impacted. So hopefully there'll be something important and impactful for each of you from the conversation. We're going to break the next hour or so into 3 parts. I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes, hopefully no more than that, laying a little bit of groundwork, providing some context, in particular looking backwards so that we can understand the context we're currently in, and maybe there's some lessons learned from the 2001 dot-com bubble and also the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. And I'll frame that in a little bit. Secondly, and I really the core of the conversation is going to be me having a conversation with Melanie and Mark, who have successfully navigated both of those timeframes and are significant business leaders here in Boise and the Treasure Valley and nationally. So there's a set of topics we're going to go through with them, a facilitated conversation. And then the third part, which really is the culmination, and we think the most important part, which is getting questions from you all that are going to be facilitated and guided by TM and Nick. So as you're listening to the conversation, we're going to cover a lot of ground. Hit us up with questions at any time, and we'll collect all those and hit them at the end. And this is meant to be the first of a series of conversations. So this is going to, by design, be very broad and cover a lot of ground and hopefully get everybody in the right mindset of this survive to thrive, and also give you a set of topics and a checklist for you to think about. But then in subsequent sessions, we're going to go deeper. On Thursday, I think Nick said we're going to have someone from the Small Business Administration talk about government programs, and then we'll have some bankers, we'll have some other folks that will come on in subsequent days and weeks to provide a bit more narrow and deep perspective on these specific topics. Our goal is to be done by around 11:15, but we can certainly go a little bit longer if the conversation's going. So again, thank you all for gathering. I mean, it's really interesting as I think about, I was mentioning it in the preamble as we were gathering before 10, this has been a good opportunity for me to look backwards. I was a CEO of a young company in 2000, 2001. I then was running a pretty significant venture capital firm in 2007, 8, and 9, and now I'm doing a lot of advisory work and teaching at entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School. So it's really interesting to have the opportunity, if you will, and really the forcing function to look back at the 2001 and 2008 timeframes and remember what it was like in those different roles. And also just reflect on how difficult it is, even in good times, to be a business leader. But in times like this, and it may sound obvious, I mean, the title of the program is Survive to Thrive. And it's always been my mindset, and whenever I'm working with young companies, is we all have ambitious visions and missions, and we want to change the world, and that's what gets us out of bed every day. But in order to achieve those outcomes, we have to, every day, and especially days like we're in right now, we have to figure out ways to survive. And sometimes we have to put on hold or on pause those bigger and more grandiose visions to make sure we're doing the things that are really needed to make sure that our organization and our teams and our communities can weather these storms. That's really the essence of the title and the essence of today's conversation. If you think about what's demanded of you as a business leader in these times, first of all, you've got to understand what's going on in the world, and it's very, very challenging. There's tons of information coming at us, so we've got to decipher that information, both at the macro level, but also how it applies to us at the more micro level. We've got to make very difficult decisions in a very uncertain information environment and a very dynamic environment, and that's always the life of a young company leader, but never more so than now. We've got to figure out what we believe, and then we've got to communicate that effectively and candidly with our team and with our community of customers and of vendors and of capital providers. And we also got to understand, we got to help them understand that the context is changing rapidly, and that the decision we make today may very well change in a week, if not tomorrow. So we've got to be very agile, and we've got to think about, as we're thinking about planning, we've got to think about contingency planning. I always have a mindset of thing I call PACE, which is my primary plan, my alternate plan, my contingency plan, and an emergency plan. So I learned that from my many years in the military. So it's PACE, primary, alternative, contingency, and emergencies. You're always thinking about alternatives. You hope for the best, but in that framework, or whatever framework you use, you're planning for the worst. And the other thing that I keep in mind that's come up a bit over the last couple of days is a thing called the Stockdale paradox. So for the first 15 years of my adult life, I was a Navy pilot and had the good opportunity to spend some time with Admiral Jim Stockdale. Some of you may or may not remember Admiral Stockdale. Well, he was a senior prisoner of war in Vietnam and was in captivity for 7 years. And the Stockdale paradox is something that he applied and in retrospect thought about what allowed him to survive and to lead in those extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And I think that applies to us here. And his mindset was, you had to deal with the harsh reality of the current situation. You couldn't be Pollyannic. You couldn't say, oh, maybe they're going to let us out this Christmas, or maybe next Thanksgiving. He was of the mindset that this is going to go on potentially indefinitely, but at the same time, he kept the mindset that it was always going to be okay, and that this experience, however difficult it was going to be transformative to him and to the folks that he was serving with. So this paradox of dealing with the harsh reality of the current situation, but always believing that it's going to be okay, is the mindset that you really are asked as business leaders to take on. And so I would, ask you to think about that. It's always, as I said earlier, you got to plan, hope for the best, plan for the worst. And some of these frameworks really are enabling you to do just that. So in order to move forward and understand where we are and the things you ought to be thinking about as business leaders, I'm going to take a quick retrospect. So I'm going to hit reflections on the 2001 dot-com bubble, and then I'm going to also talk about the 2007-2009 financial crisis. The 2001 dot-com bubble may be a little more unfamiliar to many of you, depending on where you are in your professional evolution, as it were. As we talk about these, the key to remember is that, as with all business endeavors, especially entrepreneurial ones, there is no playbook. The worst thing you can do is imagine that there's a playbook or a recipe that you can open up and follow that. Not true. So we look back only to inform the current situation, which I can guarantee you is going to be different than 01 or 07 or 08 or any other previous history. So if we sound like we know what we're talking about, it's wrong, because all we're trying to do is share our experiences. The other thing is, you read, as you read a lot of the business press, you read about what's going on in the public markets, what's going on in the government programs. There's a lot, of jargon and terms that are used. And while most of us are not really in the public market as it relates to where we access our capital, the public markets and the debt markets are a reflection of how the broader society is feeling at that moment in time, and certainly impacts how our small businesses are being impacted and our ability to access capital. As we go through this, and as you read things in the Wall Street Journal or the local press, there's really two things that you should focus on. Things that relate to the term liquidity and things that relate to the term of stimulus. What that means is liquidity is the thing we're most all focused on right now. It's how do we get access to the capital, and how do we harness our resources such that we can get through this difficult time. And then stimulus is all about, when will the demand signal, when will people start buying things again? And the government programs are focused on those two things, liquidity and stimulus. So there's lots of things happening in the broader dialogue, but as small business leaders, we need to focus on those two things, making sure we have the resources to survive, and then waiting for that moment to thrive again when the demand signal comes back on. So quickly, if you think about 2001, that was a much narrower economic challenge. Essentially what happened is venture capitalists like Mark and I put too much money into too many companies. So about $100 billion of venture capital was raised in 2000 and deployed. But it really was the time when the backbone of the internet and the modern communications infrastructure that we currently enjoy was built. The NASDAQ peaked at 5,000 in March of 2000, and over the next year lost 80% of its value. So in March of 2001, it was down at 1,000. A bunch of companies imploded, and a lot of pain and agony was felt, but it was pretty narrow based in the technology world. The broader economy was not as badly impacted. Unemployment peaked at about 5.5%, and largely there was good demand signal and good liquidity for other kind of businesses outside of the venture capital arena. As I mentioned, I was leading a wireless technology company at the time, and we were trying to raise capital in the US, and it became apparent that it was not going to happen. We ended up pivoting that technology back to Europe, raised capital from strategic partners, and built the business in Europe. So it was a major, major pivot, but that business went on to do fairly well over the next decade and get acquired. And if you look historically, about half of the businesses, the dot-com businesses that were started or growing during that time frame, survived and again became the backbone for the modern infrastructure. I do remember that soon after that, in 2003, the innovation economy was still hurting. We were just starting Flagship Ventures by bringing two venture capital firms together and raising our first fund in 2003. And it was very, very difficult to raise capital, not only into the fund, but also into great companies. So many of you probably know the company TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor was a company that we started in the Flagship offices, and we could not get a single venture capitalist to go in on that deal with us. And now it's a very, very successful public company. But we put the only $4 million that company ever took. And so, it was a time where a lot of great ideas were getting started. Amazon and Google were just starting to ramp up. So great companies are started in these downturns, but capital can be super difficult to access. So some lessons to be learned in 2001, but I think probably more appropriate. Let's fast forward to the 2007, 2009 timeframe. All of you were alive at that time, so most of you experienced it in some shape or form, so I won't give a lot of backdrop on that. But this is a much broader based economic challenge for not only the US, but also globally. So I think it's a better model for what we're dealing with now with the COVID-19 pandemic. The interesting thing is if you compare it to 2001, it took almost a year for the public markets to digest all the challenges and uncertainty. So it's actually started in 2007, the downturn, and the bottom of the market was in September 2008. We tend to call it the 2008, 2009 challenge, but it really started in 2007. In September 2008, when Lehman Brothers went under, the market started to recover. And if you look then over the next decade, up until about 2 months ago, we had an amazing, and in fact, the longest bull run in the public market. So it shows again that while things can get difficult, markets do recover and bounce back. This was difficult because it was the financial and real estate sectors. So it really impacted both liquidity and stimulus. So all the capital markets were frozen as we were waiting to see if the banks would survive. And then people were just not spending. And this is much more significant. We had unemployment rates north of 10%. And in some cases, places around the country was much, much more significant. At that point, Flagship, we had about 50 portfolio companies. I remember well, as it started to become more apparent, us sitting around the partner table and literally a couple of times a week going through the portfolio and seeing who needed cash this week, this month, this quarter, next quarter, and making very, very difficult capital allocation decisions. And that was happening, across the country, at banks and at venture capital firms everywhere. And it was really tough for about 12 or 18 months. And it took a long time for liquidity to recover and for people to start spending again. But again, we got back then into the largest bull market run that we've seen in the US history. So again, the key here is to survive so that you can thrive when things do in fact come back. If you look at today, and that'll lead us into the conversation with Mark and Melanie, I'm reading nonstop like you are. I won't try to add any punditry to it. The one thing I would add that was illuminating to me as I was listening to some things yesterday is that we're focused very much on COVID-19, but also note that there is a significant energy crisis going on with the energy battle between Russia and the Saudis. Right, that by itself historically would have caused a major disruption to the market. So if you combine COVID-19 with the oil shock, you got some pretty significant issues globally. And this is happening all at once. It's a sudden shock to the whole global system where liquidity is frozen because the capital markets, the equity markets for sure, but even the debt markets and the banks that many of you may borrow from are completely frozen, trying to figure out where the bottom is. At the same time, the entire stimulus, the demand signal is entirely gone. So the world has really never seen something like this happen so quickly and so globally at one time. So it's really new territory. The good news is that since the financial crisis, the banks and the new banking regulations have our banking system in actually pretty good health. We're seeing record low interest rates. The balance sheets of the banks are pretty strong. So once we start to get some certainty and safety back in the markets, we should see liquidity increase. The question will be when we see stimulus, when we'll see the demand signal, when people get out of their houses and start to spend as consumer and businesses. And the government programs right now, as you look into them, we'll hear more about this on Thursday, are really meant to provide the small businesses both those liquidity needs to help bridge the gap between now and when that demand signal switches back on, but also, again, trying to provide some stimulus to spenders, both on the consumer and business side, so that when people do feel safe to go back out again, we'll see some spending. My read is, and the way that I'm working with my companies is that this is going to be at least another 3 to 6 months till we start to see some stability and the volatility in the market start to settle. There's reason to believe that, once we feel clear of this, that it may be more of a, as they say, a V than a U, meaning that if we start to bounce back, it could bounce back more quickly. But again, we'll have to wait and watch and see. We're probably going to go through some pain and agony in the near term, but there's certainly every reason to believe that at some point we'll bounce back out of this. And so again, a reminder of the Stockdale paradox that let's face reality as it is today, but we know and we hope that there'll be better markets and better opportunities that will come out of that. So that's a lot. We just covered 20 years in 10 minutes, and I know you're anxious to get into survival tactics. So I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to bring Melanie and Mark into the conversation. We're going to cover a series of things on a tactical chess list, everything from managing cash down to self-care as a leader. But before we get into that, I would welcome Melanie and Mark, who've been through both of these cycles as well. Anything to add to that context, or as you reflect on your personal experiences in either 01 or 07 to 09 that you would add to the context I just provided? Melanie, maybe I'll start with you.
You covered a lot of waterfront, Jim. I have to say, I'll have to sit and digest a little bit everything you said. I think what's an added bonus to this is the no one's leaving their house, right? There's the, in those last two situations, people were still able to move around the cabin, and right now everyone's in their seats with their seatbelt on, not able to move around the cabin, and so that creates an additional emotional component to it. And so one of the things that we've been trying to tell our own staff as well as our clients is to just kind of temper the panic that comes with that, because sometimes it creates more issues. So yes, let me. There'll be definitely more things to share.
Yeah,
but go ahead, Mark, or whoever's next.
Mark, any additional comments on the context before we dive into the tactics?
Sure. Only that for me, I started my career in 1987 working for a Wall Street firm, and I was thrown right into the frying pan in October of 87 and experienced the first major downturn in my career. And this feels to me, in 1987 and 2000 and 2008, we had systemic underlying problems with our economy, whichever one of those crises you choose. To me, this feels a lot more like 9/11. Much more sudden, much more emotional, much more fear involved. What I think the country is going to bounce back slower from this than we did through 9/11. So I think as our depending upon what the federal government does to support small businesses, restaurants, startups, you name it, depending upon how the federal government reacts to that, I think this can be wind up with those same systemic problems if we don't act swiftly as a country.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and to put, I didn't mention 9/11, it was in my notes, but that happened obviously right on the heels of the dot-com bubble, so those two things together. But I think your point about fear and the societal impact versus just the economic impact is spot on, and for both of you. Okay, good. All right, thank you for that. Let's dive into the meat of the conversation. So Mark and Melanie, I know you've been on multiple phone calls with your companies. And we're going to go through topics from managing cash all the way, as I said, through how to communicate and stay grounded. But thing one becomes necessarily, managing cash. How do we manage cash, the cash we have, and how do we access additional capital, wherever the sources might be, from our investors, from our bank, from the SBA? Mark, if I start with you, what's some of the advice and things that you're hearing and tips and tricks you're hearing from your portfolio companies on this dimension?
So just for context, I worked at Highway 12 with Phil Reed for 15 years. The last 8 or close to 9 years now, I've been with Techstars, which is a global accelerator. We've had about 2,500 startups go through our accelerator programs over the years. So we're in communication with a lot of startups and a lot of founders and CEOs. And the thing that we're sharing with our founders, and a lot of them are young and going through a crisis like this for the first time. And what we're trying to remind people is that your job as CEO is to make sure your company's around tomorrow, a lot of days in a row. And that means capital. And before let's take managing capital and accessing capital as two different things. The first thing is to take I'm sure most people on this call have already done this, but it's take a look around and see where the cash is leaving the company. Pausing new hires, all new hires, pausing investing in any new projects, pausing investing in new software products, stretching vendors as far as you can, stretching rent as far as you can. Everything is about preserving cash right now. If this does wind up being a long downturn, which I think it has every possibility, it's making sure you're stopping the outflow of cash as much as you can. So that's the first line of defense, is to see where you're spending it outside of salaries. Next step is well, the next thing we're making sure we're sharing with folks is that whatever you think your plan was from a revenue perspective in 2020, tear up the paper, start over. You know, what does your burn look like at 75% of plan? What does your burn look like at 50% of plan? What does your burn look like at 25% of plan? These are realistic scenarios. And not that you have to act today thinking about a 50% of plan or 25% of plan, but to have an actionable plan in place for when revenue starts falling to those levels, instead of reacting with like a flying fire drill, you'll see much better outcomes. We are seeing a level of naivete around first-time founders and how bad it will likely be from a revenue perspective. So I think creating action items around how much runway do you have if you hit 50% of plan or 25% of plan, because as we'll go into shortly, accessing new capital is going to get harder and harder with each passing month, week, day.
Got it. Thanks, Mark. Mel, anything to add on I like the distinction between the managing and shepherding current resource, between that and accessing new capital and resources. Anything to add to the first, and then we'll get into the second?
No, I think, Mark, you did a great job at kind of summing it up. I think that really just pulling the thread a little bit, what I would add to it is, you know, think of what I see particularly with first-time entrepreneurs or people that are a little bit, maybe this is the first time they're running a business, right? Versus, you know, being an employee somewhere, is, you know, being adaptive to the change and thinking through, you know, getting off script. A lot of times people have trouble getting off script, particularly in exigent circumstances. And I would just encourage folks to, you know, get ahead of stuff. One of the things I see, you know, clients constantly do is not open up communications. You know, Mark, I'd pull the thread a little bit on, you know, talk to your landlord, talk to your vendors, talk to them now. Don't not talk to them and then create an issue, right? Because you don't want to spend legal dollars fighting with them, you know, 45, 60 days out, because now they're saying you're breaching your contract or you're not, you know, doing stuff, right? You don't want to pay us to, you know, maybe get ahead of it, because landlords aren't really interested right now in renting out new space. You know what I mean? They would rather preserve the situation and work with you, right? But they're also in business. So things like that, like not only be thoughtful about what Mark said, but truly get ahead of it, be adaptive to it. You know, the other thing is just to think about your business and, you know, adapt to the new world, right? Are there, you know, I'm not sure what all businesses we have on the call today, so I don't know how applicable this is, but, you know, you're seeing little things in the news like Medline saying, hey, we're going to take one of our business lines and create business hand sanitizer, right? You know, not something they normally do, but something they're going to do today, right? I don't know what those things are for the constituents on the call today, but are there will be opportunity in this market. And is there a way that you could respond to that opportunity? You know, to your point, get off your plan, right? And be adaptive to the new circumstance and, you know, consider other ways.
Jim, if I may, before we get on to accessing capital, I have a couple more thoughts on sort of preserving capital. And and this is an emotional subject for a lot of people, but you get to the point where you've pulled all the levers and turned all the knobs around managing cash without laying people off. And what we're finding, especially in small companies, that unlike a purely financial crisis, it feels like today founders and teams are very reticent to do layoffs. Casting people out into this coronavirus world, not only without a job and no prospect for getting a job because nobody's going to be hiring, but the added burden of having to deal with this fear-induced world that we're now living in. And something I've seen work really, really well over the years in small companies. The bigger the company, the harder this becomes. But the natural inclination of a lot of founders or CEOs, to be specific, is to do across the board salary reductions. Hey, we got to get through this. We're going to do a 20% across the board salary reduction. There's a strategy around salary reductions that I think can actually be much more effective, meaning save the company more money. And that is, you got a team of 10 or 15 or 20 or maybe even 30 people. You get on a Zoom call like this and the CEO talks to the entire company and they say, look, the last thing we want to do is cut anybody from our team. This is our family and we're going to get through this together. Unfortunately, we have to make, my job is the preservation of the company. And unfortunately, we have to do everything we can to preserve cash to make it through this and survive this crisis. I need everybody, and by the way, in this conversation, there are no titles. It doesn't matter whether you're an entry-level software engineer or a VP level in the company. I need to know what you need on a monthly basis to just pay your bills. That's it. What do you need to survive so that you can get through this crisis? And I think it's important for the senior management team to have that discussion first among them and come to the rest of the company and saying, on the senior management team, if you look at the 4 of us or 5 of us or 7 of us, we've reduced our salaries by 30%, by 40%, by 50%, by 75%. I've seen 75%. And what we're asking each of you to do is come to us and tell us, what do you need on a monthly basis so that we can do everything we can to avoid having to lay people off? And time again, this exercise has produced remarkable results far in excess of the broad across the board 10 or 20% salary reductions. It's been very effective.
Yeah, I like that approach, Mark, because people probably also feel like they have a buy-in versus receiving, right? You know what I mean? They feel like they have a buy-in. Mark, Jim, not to take yours, but before we segue into the next topic, Jim, I think you and Mark would be in a better position to talk about this. One of the things we see with our clients when they're trying to access capital is not having a sufficient cash cushion, right? So Jim, do you think it might help as a segue into the next topic, if we're ready to move into it, to maybe kind of talk about what should that look like? I mean, I know none of us know when this pandemic's going to truly kind of flatten out and, we're going to be able to come out, but, what should some of these companies be thinking about in their cash reserves? You know what I mean?
I do. I'll share a couple of thoughts and then bounce to Mark. And I want to come back to the team and the layoff cutback issue with you, Melanie, and just have you guide us a little bit of how we think about legally healthcare and benefits and things like that, how we manage not just the salary piece, but the important topic of healthcare. So we'll come back to that. So first of all, I think that accessing capital is going to be challenging for several weeks, maybe several months. If you look at capital providers, whether they're banks and especially equity investors on the private side, venture capitalists, angels and such, the first instinct and the first priority for those firms, just like the companies themselves, is to survive. And that means that, as I indicated, what we did at Flagship in 2008, 2009, we weren't looking at new deals. we were essentially going through the portfolio and deciding how we were going to allocate the capital we had. I mean, the business of a venture investor or any kind of equity investor is you put a bit of money in, hopefully good things happen, and then that company can go access capital from others. And you might put a little bit more in. But in this case, where it's going to be really difficult to access capital from new providers, the capital providers are thinking about their own portfolio and how much they have to support their company. So they're going to be working closely with the companies, as Mark is doing, and having communication about your plans, your cutbacks, et cetera, but also how much capital they can provide. And I've not been a banker, but I've worked with them, and they sort of think similarly. And so your first instinct ought to be, in addition to talking to your customers and your vendors and your team, talk to your capital providers, sit down with a cogent plan that says, hey, listen, this is where I am. This is what I need from you. Here's what we're willing to do. I think spending a bunch of time trying to access new capital, if your business is challenged or you're looking like you're going to run out of capital, is a tough place to be. If you have a decent business and your cutbacks are going to allow you to be break even on a cash flow basis, it may be quite a good time then to go have a conversation with a banker, or figure out how to finance other assets that might be, if you own a small business and you own a home, interest rates are very, very low right now. And I don't suggest you lever up your house, but if you have a lot of equity in your home, you can get a pretty good home equity line of credit to use that capital onto the business side. So thing one is do your planning, as you've heard from Mark and Melanie, and then go and have good communication with all your stakeholders, including your investors and your bankers. I wouldn't spend a ton of time looking for new capital unless your business is fairly solid and it's more on the debt than the equity side right now. Mark, what would you add or subtract from that?
Well, there's two, as far as equity goes, you have two places to look: existing investors that you already have and new investors. And then with new investors, there's two different situations. If you're a startup and you're in the middle of a financing discussion with potential partners, you need a great deal of situational awareness. Every single day that passes, the odds of closing a round of new equity capital or even debt capital get smaller and smaller. So there's three things that are involved in that people generally try and optimize for in a financing, and that's terms, speed, and certainty. And I think it's really important right now to optimize on the latter two, and stop negotiating the terms. If you're in discussions with an equity investor, one of the earliest things I ever learned in venture was the term drink when served. Right today, if somebody's offering you capital for your business, take it. The terms don't matter. Be as opportunistic as you can, strengthen your balance sheet, take more money than you think you need. Same goes for M&A. If you're in the middle of M&A discussions, as some of our portfolio companies are, stop negotiating the small things and get the deal done. With every passing day, there's an old adage that time kills every negotiation. That's never been more true than right now. So our portfolio companies that are in the middle of financing rounds with new equity partners, we're just stressing the importance of getting that done. Jim, I do see a difference between 2008, 2009, and today with regard to venture capital firms, in the fact that I am seeing a lot of and hearing a lot of stories about venture capital firms that are actually issuing term sheets to companies without even meeting them. Pitch on Zoom, due diligence on Zoom, term sheet on Zoom. Now, I think a lot of that is marketing. Hey, we're still open for business, we're financing companies, but there is more capital in the system from an equity perspective today than even in 2000. And there are so many small micro funds, gender-focused funds, diversity-focused funds, vertical-specific funds that are flush with cash. And I think they are going to be selectively finding opportunities in companies that can weather this. Perhaps we're going to see a bunch of company formation around things that are pertinent to helping workers from home, helping with bandwidth. We're seeing some really interesting pitches from companies already that are specifically designed to help humanity in this new world order. So I do think that there's more capital than, so don't think that the equity markets are shut off. I think it's who you are, what you're working on, and I wouldn't stop having those conversations. I'd approach them with a level of realism on the ability to access that type of capital.
I think that's, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a second part, sorry for being verbose here, but there's a second part that I think is much more important. And I think that's your existing investors. I think that right now, people are scared to call their existing investors because they're scared to hear what they're going to hear. It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy of, I know these people are sort of in my camp and behind me, but I'm terrified to call them and find out that they can't give me any more money. And I think it's important to call them, every one of them, if you haven't already, and just find out how much they may or may not have for you. You need that information for planning purposes. Mm-hmm. And also understand that that may change daily. And if your existing investors are individuals, angel investors, all the more likely that those situations are going to change daily. The stock market is determining in many instances how much cash they have available. And with the market behaving as it has lately and probably will for a while, their ability to access cash, be liquid to help you is decreasing quickly. So I think the important thing is to call them, be radically transparent with them about the state of the business, and ask them what they think you should do. And I know these phone calls are really hard, but they're critical to make decisions. The answer may be zero, but even that is useful information in your plan.
I think it's two great points. One is the communication with your investors. It's an old adage that companies don't run out of capital; they run out of trust. And so I think you've done what you've done to build trust with your investors and your stakeholders. Now is the time to really double down on that. And I like your amendment, Mark. I do think that if your business, and to Melanie's point, there are many opportunities in this disruption right now. So whether you have a business that plays well into it, or you could pivot into that type of business model or offering, I think is key. Just be clear-eyed about whether you're going for third-party capital to try to hold on, or whether you're going to be able to present an upside opportunity and allocate your time, which is probably the most challenging piece. Nick and TM, I'm realizing that we probably need a whole. That's why we're going to do the follow-on segments. We could. Mark, Melanie, and I could probably talk for another hour just on the cash and the capital side. Melanie, I want to come back to you when we're talking about HR issues and we're talking about cutbacks or layoffs. What sort of broad-based legal advice, or where can folks go to understand what it means, how to take care of their people in difficult times, what healthcare benefits they can provide or need to provide?
Yeah, I would say let me unpack that a little bit, Jim. I think what's really been interesting to watch, particularly in Idaho. So a little bit of background for those of you on the phone. I'm in Boise, and my firm's in Boise, but we're also international, and we have offices in China. We have offices in Seattle, we have offices in New York, and as part of firm management, I've been watching this for 3-4 months now, you know what I mean, as it's rolled over from Asia to the US. And Jim, back to your point, I think what's really, there's a whole lot of things folks can be thinking about right now. And I mean, at the risk of sounding like some kind of sales pitch, depending on what state or jurisdiction you're in, there's a lot more local and state influence now that you have to pay attention to. I suspect most of the people are that are on the phone are local. But depending on where you are, depending on what state or, city you're in for that matter, there's a lot more local and state ordinances than we've seen probably in most of our lifetimes. You know what I mean? You've got city mayors and governors kind of putting out edicts, ordinances that, we just really haven't seen in our lifetime, stay at home, do this kind of stuff. And it's interesting to me to watch employers not necessarily abide by those. You know what I mean? And one of the important kind of vernaculars we're seeing out there is, are you an essential business or are you a non-essential business? It hasn't totally hit Idaho yet, but it's a matter of time. I mean, it's a matter of time. It'll probably happen within, my guess, by the end of the week, that we're going to start hearing those kinds of proclamations coming down, because we're seeing that in New York, we're seeing it in California, Oregon, all these states where, the governor or the city, as the case may be, are saying things like, no, really, stay home. You know what I mean? And so I think businesses, particularly in Idaho, need to get ahead of that and be thinking to themselves, if I haven't already sent my workforce home, what are they ready? You know what I mean? Are they ready? Are they already working from home? Can they work from home? Am I an essential business? Am I a non-essential business? It's way too soon to see what kind of liability is going to crop from this. But you know what I mean? I think there's just a liability issue. There's also just a social responsibility issue there. You know what I mean? And do you want to be a leader in that, or do you want to be a follower in that? And that starts to impact, Jim, what you were asking about, which is, we're getting a lot of questions about, well, what do I do with those employees? And I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis, but, do I furlough them? Do I, you know what I mean? Do I, so that they can maybe go get benefits? You know what I mean? Do I, Mark, to your point, do we reduce salaries? Like, what do we do? These are really important decisions. To be thinking through, and be thinking through with your advisors, because depending on how small or big your business is, are you riffing them? Do you have to follow the, labor guidelines on those things, or are you small enough that you don't have to? There's just a lot to be thinking through. One of the biggest things we're also seeing is, hey, one of my employees is, has Corona. What do we do? You know what I mean? What does that look like? Can I fire the person? You know what I mean? There's just a lot of new situations out there that I think this workforce hasn't had to deal with ever.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you both. I'm looking at the chat, some good chat, so we'll capture that and share that out with everybody. I would urge, if you, we've only got a couple of questions, so if you have some questions, please don't be bashful. Send them to Nick and Tim. We'll get to them here in the final segment. Also, I would urge everyone, at the end, we'll share out where there's going to be links for some Slack channels and some other information where we're going to try to collect all of this info and these links and resources. A lot of good information being put out. So TM and Nick will be organizing, collecting those, and making sure everybody in the community has access to those. So let me try to move, let me couple the next two topics together, which relates to a broader stakeholder base for the businesses, whether it's the customers or vendors, how we manage those relationships, continue to build trust. Can we find out ways that everybody together can weather the storm? And that's both a relationship piece, but there's a contractual piece to that as well, about how we think about contracts with customers and contracts with vendors. And again, these liabilities of the current situation. So Mark, if I could turn to you, what advice are you giving your companies about how to engage with both the vendors and supply chain, but importantly the customers? And then Melanie, add to that, but overlay how we think about contracts in this context.
I tell them to talk to people like Melanie. So I'm going to let her answer.
Okay, Melanie, let's start with contracts. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's really interesting because, for lawyers and non-lawyers alike, there's that, last section of the contract that's usually called like miscellaneous, right? There's the article, the very last article in the back of the contract, and it has all that stuff in it, like, can I assign the contract? Can I not assign, notice, stuff like that. And usually tucked away in there is what we call force majeure, right? And people don't think about it. It's been boilerplate. No one really, pays attention to it. But if you look at that, there's a lot of times where if people just can't perform on a contract, and usually that section will say things like, force majeure applies to, acts of terrorism, war, pestilence, pandemics, things like that. you should be looking at your contracts and from both a receiving and a giving side and say, do I have to perform? You know what I mean? Is this pandemic, you know, a reason for me to not be obligated to perform? Or reciprocally, is this pandemic a reason why my, you know, vendor doesn't have to send me those supplies anymore? You know what I mean? Because I need them to, you know? So that's been something that's been very interesting. And what we're also starting to see is the ripple into M&A. And what does this mean? Well, insurance period, you know what I mean? Just insurance generally. Does insurance cover this? Does it not cover this? You know, people have things like business, you know, disruption or interruption insurance, things of that nature. And, you know, in the fine print, is a pandemic a reason not for the policy to hit? So it's interesting because it's an act. What force majeure is an act beyond any of our control, right? So why should we have to, you know, perform when it's something that's out of our control? So it's something that's been tucked away in contracts for years that no one thought about, and all of a sudden everyone's dusting it off and looking at it right now.
Got it. You know, yet another topic that we could go, and we will go narrow and deep on and follow on sessions, just so we think about, you know, contracts and insurance and liability issues. The one thing I would say, you know, about customers and vendors is very much to double click on what Mark laid out, which is have the conversation.
Yep.
Not just with your team, not just with your investors, but have conversations with your supply chain, your customers. They're all going through the same things. There's a lot of creative work that can be done. If you have big customers, they may have more cash and may want to be more price sensitive later. You can negotiate a little bit of payment now for a reduction or preferred status later with your vendors. If you're a service provider, you can do the same thing with your customers. Everybody is in this together, truly, which I think is relatively unique, a bit more like 9/11, certainly in the US. So there's conversations to be had, and be creative about ways to solve problems. Not everybody has the same issues, and so maybe you can trade off. So again, it's about having conversations.
Well, and Jim, to that, and not to belabor what you're saying, but, you know, we always say, don't let form drive substance, right? And people have a tendency to want to hide behind the contract. And, you know, part of my point is with force majeure, you may not be able to hide behind the contract anymore. And, you know, businesses tend to want to deal with other people who are open and, you know, transparent and having these conversations. And, you know, Mark, to your point, it's fluid. It's changing daily, hourly. So, you know, I can't encourage folks enough to just get out ahead of it and start opening these discussions with folks, because, you know, depending on who's on the other side of the contract, they may only have so much to give, and they're probably going to be more interested in talking with the people who are open and in having these discussions than reactive 30 days from now.
Got it. The topic of regulations and government support's a big one. Nick, is it correct? Thursday, we're going to have an SBA wrap on?
Yeah, we'll have Christian Pennington from the SBA. He'll be joining us and talking about the disaster assistance, which, like a lot of these topics, we could spend hours on, but we'll certainly be diving deeper into that discussion on Thursday with a time to be set still.
Perfect. All right, so keep an eye out on that. We're going to bounce across that. And I'm going to hit quickly on communication strategies and styles. And Mark, come to you. And we've talked about the importance of communication. I think folks understand that. But especially for young leaders who haven't been through difficult situations, you got to kind of step up and have these candid, difficult conversations with a variety of stakeholders. What have you found as you watch your company leaders? What best practices are you seeing that others can embrace?
Yeah, this is pretty much how I'm spending my days, talking about this subject with young CEOs and first-time founders. They're being thrust into the crucible of leadership, and leadership is easy. And you know, since 2009, in this bull market, this historic bull market you've been talking about, we're pretty much, as everywhere you look, everything's up and to the right. And there's a term I've used for a long time in my career that applies to lots of situations. And I used it earlier, and it's radical transparency. And I think more than ever right now, leaders need to talk to their employees with a level of candor and transparency that maybe they've never done before. I think every employee deserves that type of intellectual and emotional transparency from their leaders. It's okay to express fear and pressure. The important part is doing it without drama. That's the hard part of being a leader. It reinforces confidence in everyone around you. I was on a call yesterday with a company I'm on the board of, where the CEO founder, about a 30-person company, and he announced that he was going to have to lay a third of the company off. It was an hour Zoom call, much like this, and I'm pretty sure the CEO cried through the entire hour. It was gut-wrenching to watch. But he did it with a level of dignity and authenticity that was admirable. I think one of the most inspiring things was the employees that were being laid off were more worried about him than themselves. And I'm seeing this every single day. I'm on the board of a company with 100 employees, where 2.5 weeks ago, they got a term sheet for a $30 million Series C growth round. And 5 days ago, we had to close the doors and lay off everybody. 100 employees laid off. This is a company that now, the company's in mothball. It's a public-facing company. It's called 2-Bit Circus. They have a big experiential next-generation technology circus in Los Angeles. They had to close their doors because it's where the public comes to play. And we've mothballed the company. We've got a little less than $1 million in cash, and we're going to do everything we can to hope that the company can reopen at the end of this. But there's no shame in companies being extremely hindered or even failing when it comes to these black swan events. And I think the important thing is to talk to your employees and all of your constituents with a level of candor and authenticity that you might not even know you're capable of. But I think that's what's fair in times like these to the people that you work for. We're lucky at Techstars. We have a really strong balance sheet, but I'm on the board of the company, and we're trying to think about what does this look like when our corporate partners start bailing on us. And we've got 350 employees around the world, and we're talking to our employees daily right now. In our individual teams, one of the things we're doing at Techstars and a lot of the companies I'm working with is having these Zoom calls for an hour a day with no agenda. People are doing email, they're sharing music, their kids are on their laps, their pets are in the background, they're sitting in their pajamas. And it's actually one of the beautiful things that come from crises like this is there's an element of we're seeing a sea change in how people work. Think about technologies like touchscreens. We're probably not going to see a proliferation of touchscreens in our future as a result of this. The whole world order of how people work is going to change as a result of this crisis. And one of those ramifications is going to be how many more people are going to work from home? What's the new normal when all this is past us about work from home, work remotely, collaboration tools? These are the opportunities we're talking about. But I think more importantly than ever, from a leadership perspective, treating your employees with a great deal of compassion and empathy is critical to getting through this knothole.
Yeah, I think well said, Mark. I mean, this is hard enough if you actually were all physically in the same place. but we're seeing folks have to not only figure out how to step up as leaders, but as digital leaders. And I think one of the most important things, having led organizations through difficult times, is that the leader has to be all the things that Mark indicated, but you also got to be present, you got to be prepared. We're going to turn to how to take care of yourself here in a minute, but in the digital context, how do you do that? What's the right battle rhythm for your company right now? Is it time for you to slow down and preserve resources, or do you have to actually go faster and ask more of your people? So figuring out and getting clarity and conviction in your own mind as the leader of what you need from your organization and communicating that on a regular basis, and then bringing the humanity of the situation to bear. Melanie, anything to add to that before we turn to, how as a leader you take care of yourself so you can actually take care of your team?
I think you and Mark did a really good job covering a lot of stuff. I can definitely tell you, from our own organization, we've learned a lot of things. I mean, I think that, up to a month ago, a lot of folks prided themselves on their ability to be agile remotely. But this is brand new. You know what I mean? In our organization, for example, it's not just the executives who are traveling that have their laptop. You know what I mean? It's the receptionist. It's the secretary. You know what I mean? It's what do you do with the janitorial staff and folks that are historically, boots on the ground kind of jobs, right? And, knowing and learning how to be adaptive to that and making sure that, everyone has the right resources at home and that they have the right tools, because some people aren't used to this. You know what I mean? It's a new era for them. For example, we found with our, secretaries, I mean, who would have ever thought secretaries, would be, in a law firm working from home, right? And so we had to be creative in the approach and make sure that they had the right tools, and we have to check in with them daily and make sure that they, are, supported. There's also a few unique things to be sensitive to with your employees and the folks that you're working with. A lot of folks that work from home are used to their children being in school. You know what I mean? They're used to everybody in their household going about their daily routine. And now people are having to get used to, I mean, we've always had the metaphoric dog bark in the background, but now it's like, everybody has the metaphoric dog barking in the background, right? Everybody has the kid running in and, their video camera going live and not realizing that, someone's behind them doing something silly, or, just different things like that are happening. And I think as a leader, some of the things we're seeing in our organization, particularly lawyers, right? Because lawyers are historically, FaceTime kind of folks. And I think a lot of our leaders out in the community think that they're more evolved than that. But when push comes to shove, trust your workers, I mean, because people have a tendency to be like, oh, they're home. They're probably only doing 60% of what they should be doing. Are they really doing 100%? And, right now we don't have a choice. You know what I mean? We have to kind of trust our employees. We have to trust our workforce. We have to hope that they're getting their jobs done. And you know what? There will be a time to measure that. You know what I mean? And you can deal with that later. But for now, make sure they have the right resources. Be sensitive to things like childcare, right? They don't have a nanny. The nanny can't come to the house right now. You know what I mean? There's just a lot of extra things that we're going to have to deal with our workforce. It's a little bit more unique than a typical work from home situation.
Got it. And Melanie, what's your number one, what are you doing to self-care? What's your number one piece of advice to folks in this time frame, or at least what you would aspire to be doing so that you can take care of yourself, so you can take care of your clients and your team?
I don't know that this is responsive, Jim, to your question, but one of the things that I wasn't really prepared for was that there were a lot of folks in my office who were frankly just scared, right? Like just scared. They couldn't articulate that. You know what I mean? And when you're at work and in the office, it's easy to separate work from home from everything else, right? So you just kind of go to the office and you say, are you getting your job done? Or you're not getting your job done or whatnot. And I've found that, I had to be the person who stopped going into the office, for example, right? I had to stop for two reasons. One, because I need to be there. I need to be around through the next few months, right? If I get sick, I mean, somebody can take over. We're all fungible, but the point is that's not ideal, right? And I was finding that folks were, insisting on still going in and whatnot. So I realized that like I was signaling to folks, you know what I mean? And then, I realized we've been doing, Mark, to your point, we've been doing like daily communications in the office, right? I don't know if people appreciate it or not, but we've been making jokes. I asked everybody in the office to give me some unique aspects about them that no one would know, and we've been doing daily trivia in the office. Guess who this person is? Guess who that person is? We're going to have a big raffle and a party when we all get to go back to the office. And I've had more folks reach out to me and say, thank you. I needed that levity today. You know what I mean? And so I know that's not really responsive to what you were saying, Jim. I mean, for my own self, I'm, getting sleep, drinking 60 ounces of water a day, making sure that I go walk outside and, do all those things, frankly, I've probably gotten more sleep than I've gotten in the last 5 years.
Got it. We're going to pivot to questions. Mark, anything you feel compelled to add to that before I turn to Nick? And I've not managed time well. I apologize for that, but there's so much richness here. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, it might sound a little controversial, but because we're so prone to self-medicate at times like these. But if you're running a business, it's a great time not to use alcohol. You don't sleep as well. It becomes a crutch. Everyone's so quick to reach for that bottle at the end of the day, or even before the day ends. And I just think that it inhibits our ability to get the most out of ourselves right now. And a time where maybe we need it the most, to have a drink, to relax. But I feel like watching my peers and talking about this with a lot of CEOs, that replacing that urge with going for a walk and getting some vitamin D. Right now you need to have your A game every single day. And the ways we self-medicate generally inhibit that. So it's not something that normally comes up in conversations like this, but I think that if you're going to bring your A game every day to get through a crisis like this, don't do things that inhibit your sleep. Try and eat healthier. And it's hard because we're stuck at home with frozen food and snacks. And so it becomes even hard. It's this self-perpetuating spiral. So I think as hard as it is, when it seems like the world is crashing around us, to get outside, get some sun on your face, go for a walk, go for a bike ride. Here in Idaho, how lucky are we that even though we need to practice safe social distancing, that we can still get outside and enjoy the outdoors and get some exercise. So for me, as it relates to self-care, these are the things I'm really trying to get the people I'm working closely with, to understand.
Yeah, thank you both. We're in a great year. Those of us here in the Boise area in a great spot to be quarantined, because there's a lot of outdoor space. You can have some outdoor space and some exercise. So while we've been talking, all of you are having your own experiences with self-care, with communication, with digital leadership. So please share what you're learning. Share what you're learning with the community and with Nick and TM, so we can share those experiences, see what's working and what's not working. We very much appreciate that. So Nick and TM, over to you for some questions. I promised that we would be done in 75 minutes. That's about 3 minutes away. If you need to drop, feel free, but we'll definitely going to stop at 11:30 Mountain Time. So 18 minutes if we have questions to fill that. And I know the last couple of minutes, Tim and Nick are going to frame what's upcoming. So over to you guys.
Yeah. Well, one, if you haven't done it yet, I would just encourage everyone to look in the group chat. There have been some really good resources shared in there, everything from the Science of Wellbeing course offered via Coursera to Perkins Coie's vast resources. And I think that the chat is just one small example of the power of community, and that's certainly something we're seeing across the board here. So get in there and check out all the resources. First question came up was, what are the potential benefits or negative considerations to launching a new business in uncertain times? What advice do you have for engaging with new prospects with the utmost empathy?
I'll take a first crack. I think launching a business today your chances of success is largely based on what type of business that is. If it's a business that has sprung from an idea that you've had as a result of this crisis in a way to address the new normal, and you can access capital and figure out a way to get it off the ground, far be it for me, who funds people with crazy ideas, to tell you not to do that. I started Highway 12 Ventures with Phil Reed in quite possibly the worst time to start a venture capital firm in the history of venture capital. I started raising Highway 12's first fund at the beginning of 2000, right before the entire .com implosion. It took me almost 2 years to raise that fund. I was living in my mother-in-law's basement. I was burning through my life savings. And it took me 300 meetings to raise a $25 million fund. And I just felt like the opportunity was there to have a venture capital firm here in Idaho. And I was lucky enough that I survived that 2-year period in getting it off the ground, and it launched the next 20 years of my career. I think if I would have polled 100 people in 2000, whether that was a good time to start raising a venture capital fund, 100 would tell me that that was a stupid idea. So, I've spent the last 25 years working with people who most of the people tell them they shouldn't do what they're doing. So far be it for me to tell you that it's not a great time to start a business. The biggest businesses Highway 12 ever invested in, the ones that had the biggest outcomes, all started in the 18 months after Sequoia's famous Rip Good Times. Mm-hmm. Great companies are going to be founded in the next 12 months.
Yeah, I would echo that. I had some highlights I share with you throughout my preamble. A couple things. One, Mark alluded to it, as did Melanie, but there are some fundamental shifts that are going to happen in society. The role of technology, digital leadership, healthcare, telemedicine. I mean, this experience is going to provide some fundamentally exciting breakthroughs and need for new business and business models. So if you have a perspective there, you can pivot your current business into that. That's exciting. Talent. I mean, unfortunately, we're going to have some folks who are going to be out of work, and there's going to be some very talented people. So, the war for talent is always a real thing and a big issue in a bull market. So there's going to be some great people out there. And there's a lot of capital, as Mark alluded to earlier, there's a lot of capital still sitting on the balance sheet of venture capital, private equity firms, and banks. And when the market comes back, angel investors portfolio. So, not today, but in 12 or 24 months, there'll be capital. And that's when these new ideas will probably need it. So some of the best businesses in history have been started in downturns. And it may be that you're also find yourself on or underemployed. So as opposed to, use the time meaningfully if that is the situation.
Melanie, any thoughts to add there?
I don't really have a whole lot to add other than, no matter what the time is, a lot of times when you're working with entrepreneurs, you always have the conversation of, are you looking for your next job, or are you truly trying to, create a business and, create value? And so I think that if you're looking for your next job, this isn't necessarily the best time, you know what I mean, to start a business. But I absolutely agree with everything, you know, Mark and Jim said. I mean, the phoenix rises from the ashes. So that's what history has shown us, you know, again and again and again. And so if you can be the phoenix, you know, you should go for it, right? Opportunity always comes from, you know, lack of opportunity, right? And that's what this is going to be. It's just going to be who's going to have the vision, who's going to have the vision to come up with those ideas, and capitalize off of the, you know, the different things. And Jim, I love your point about, you know, workforce, right? You know, when we go through times like this, I kind of view it as an evolutionary recalibrating, right? And I think that there's going to be a lot of that, you know, workforce, just things, you know, you mentioned telemedicine. I mean, it's such a highly regulated area right now. I would love to see, you know, some change so that that could become a better resource for folks. And maybe this will stimulate that.
Agreed.
So all of you mentioned the importance of reaching out to your investors, and you know, we can even throw traditional banks, things like that into the fold here. But the question came up: what should founders and CEOs be ready to speak to when they make that call? What are the questions that you've asked in the past, or that you're advising your companies to be thinking about right now as they pick up that phone and are proactive in reaching out to their funders?
History favors the prepared, right?
Yeah.
I think it's going in with a plan that's realistic, and not just filled with optimism. I think it's, you know, our new plan, our revised plan for 2020. We took 2020's plan and ripped it up. Here's our revised plan based upon what the world looks like today. But we also have an operating plan for hitting 75% of that plan or 50% of that plan, and show it to them. It involves headcount. It involves sales, and I think the best, when you talk to people who know what they're doing as it relates to investing capital, especially professional investors and even savvy angel investors, the number one tool that investors employ really is a good bullshit detector. And I think trying to bullshit your way through a financing in times like these is a non-starter.
Yeah.
When times are great and things are plentiful and cash is flowing, you can get by with a degree of promotionalism that you just can't today. If you're going for a financing, you better walk into that financing meeting with your CFO at your side and the ability to rationally show how the company not only gets through. I think you should be planning on 18 months of hard times. I think the rest of 2020 is going to be a bear, personally. I think 30 to 40% of startups are going to disappear within a year. That's my personal perspective from living through a few. That doesn't mean I'm right. That's one person's opinion. I think it's tragic, but I've lived through it before. So if you're not walking into a financing meeting with a plan to show how you're going to get through 18 months of hardship, I think your chances of accessing capital are going to be difficult.
Yeah, and I want to put a fine point on what you're saying, Mark, because I think that's sage advice, no matter what, you know, is going on in the world, right? But it's particularly important now. You know what I mean? A lot of folks don't have solid business plans. You know, they have arbitrary amounts of money that they think they need. That's likely not going to fly right now. You know what I mean? It's going to have to be real, and it can't be, you know, because I need a salary. It's going to have to be, this is what keeps my business growing. This is what keeps my business. People aren't going to be interested in life support money right now. I'm just I don't mean to sound negative, but people aren't going to be interested in helping a company limp along 6 months longer than it would. You know what I mean? But they will be interested in, opportunistic, growth or helping people weather the storm. But you need to be the advocate. You need to be able to support that and have those conversations with folks, and it has to be genuine. They'll see through it.
Three quick things. One is not only show up with a plan, but show the skin you or the extra skin you and the team are putting in. Right? You have to take the most pain if you're going to get investors to support you. Second is understand the investor type, their incentives, their situation. Right? So it's both having compassion, empathy, but really economically understanding what they're trying to solve for, and whether or not they have capital, as Mark alluded to earlier. And third, realize that we have been in an extraordinarily founder-friendly, business-friendly environment, and that probably has already changed. So if you're sitting there with unpriced securities like a safe or a convertible note that's got a super duper high cap on it, or you're sitting there with some debt that's got friendly terms, the chances are that the terms you're going to get for capital are not going to be nearly as friendly, just because of the reality of the capital providers' constraints. And so you got to go in with that mindset, and to Mark's three things, sort of price and structure sort of becomes tertiary, but also remember that in order to get new capital, you have to get alignment from your existing capital providers. So that means that some of your existing investors may have to be willing to be restructured to get new capital. So there's a lot of complexity in preparing for and having those conversations.
Okay. One question that came up from some of our friends at One Stone was related to how you would advise student entrepreneurs to spend their time. Any certificates, skill sets, other things that you would recommend some of our younger colleagues looking to become the next entrepreneurs that you're investing in spend their time with all this extra downtime?
I learned a lot. I learned 95% of the lessons I learned about startups through tragic outcomes. I learned almost nothing from the good times. If you are a student and you are looking for enriching yourself in how businesses are built and launched and thrived and survive, it is a great time to be a student. There's never been more information available to you. So being at Techstars, where we are all about mentorship, I would say there's find yourself a mentor. Find somebody that you have a relationship with that can talk to you in real time about what's going on right now and how they're handling it. And it doesn't matter whether it's a retail shop or a direct-to-consumer website or business-to-business enterprise software. It's still managing through a crisis. And I still think experiential learning is the best way to learn. And, when Phil and I learned more through the companies that failed at Highway 12 than we did from the ones that worked. So, find yourself some folks who are running businesses and try and spend 15, 20 minutes a week with them, just asking them questions and having a weekly cadence of discussions about how they're dealing with this difficult situation.
I love the question, and I love Mark's answer. And so I'm in constant conversation. I'm not teaching an active course. I teach in the fall at HBS, but I'm in conversation with a lot, at 100+ students, and a lot of them are starting businesses. So lots of conversations with them about how lucky they are to be going through this. They don't really believe it yet, but I'm trying to convince them of that. So it's a really good opportunity. And I also think that the younger generation has it hard. They're being saddled with the long time frames ahead around climate change, around whatever comes out of the pandemic, the economic crisis. So I think let your sense of injustice and frustration fuel you, because I think those businesses that are driven by real purpose and real mission and a real fundamental desire and insight to change the world are the really exciting ones. So, you know, anybody, but especially our younger folks, you know, who see that are going to have a different perspective, go at it. And it's our job, you know, as a community to support them in that endeavor. And Nick, I'm sure I don't know if Melanie has anything to add, but Nick, I'm sure you're watching the time, and I promise it's out of here at 11:30. So maybe Melanie has a thought, and if you want to wrap, or I don't know how you want to bring this to closure, but I'll turn it over to you after Melanie.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to what you guys said, other than, you know, a lot of folks might be looking for some free air quote internship end quote opportunities right now, right? Like, as they're managing their own resources. So, I mean, for the students who are asking those questions, you know, are you looking for something, like, are you looking for true experience or something to, you know, build your resume, or maybe both, right? But there's probably, you know, maybe not to, you know, put TM and Nick on the spot, but there may be a few startups in the community that would love some, you know, folks who can roll up their sleeves and help right around now, when maybe resources are a little thinner than normal. And so maybe there's a little quid pro quo there.
Great. Thank you for those final remarks, Melanie. And I feel confident in saying, yes, there are a lot of startups between Venture College and Trailhead that would love to have some assistance. One shameless plug from the Venture College, Thursday, April 2nd at 4 o'clock, we will have 23 teams from throughout Idaho pitching for the Idaho Entrepreneurship Challenge. It'll be live streamed on our Boise State Twitch channel. The live stream will be the 4 winners of each individual track, but it's just another opportunity to tune in, see some of these young, talented entrepreneurs that are pursuing their ideas, and you know, of course, we'd love to have you cheering them on virtually. As we mentioned earlier in the call, we're going to have another one of these on Thursday with Christian Pennington from the SBA. He'll be talking about the disaster financing available in Idaho that just got announced yesterday. And I know that a lot of folks are in need of it. So we'll be pulling him and perhaps a few others in to talk about that. We're still nailing down the time, but we have everyone's contact information from the registration for this chat. We will follow up from here with a list of resources and places you can access those resources, as well as a recording of this discussion and the time for the next discussion. And I think for now, you know, we want to do as many of these as we can. If you have any ideas on topics or themes that you're hearing about or that you really are in dire need of, feel free to contact myself or TM directly, and we'll be glad to put together some speakers. So maybe with that, I'll pitch it over to TM and we can wrap up.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, just in closing to add, you know, my main takeaway from the discussion today is something that I've had to be reminded of today by listening to all of you. There's a fine balance for leaders between hard skills and soft skills. And what I mean by that is between thinking and feeling. And I've got a really good cross section today, just listening to the 3 of you, pivoting back and forth between thinking and feeling yourself through this crisis. And, you know, for me personally, I've been faced with a very strong sense of immediacy and also fear, which is just to say, and that's to be human. And as we face those emotions, the sense of immediacy and fear, and we're trying to navigate through this crisis, I just, for one, applaud our panelists to take the time to talk about these topics to our community, but I also encourage the community to not tuck their tails during this crisis. Speak up, communicate to us, take advantage of this webinar, of our next webinar, and please let us know where we stand with respect to the topics that you want to hear about. So my main takeaway is to go ahead and rebalance the amount of thinking and feeling that I'm doing as I'm trying to navigate Trailhead through this crisis as well. So thank you for that.
Great. Awesome. Thank you both. Thank you, Mark and Melanie. It was a great conversation.
Absolutely.
I learned a lot as well. So everybody keep breathing out there and be in touch. Thank you all.
Good luck, everybody.
Stay
Bye.
healthy.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.